Today is April 6, 2006. We're having another oral history interview. Our interviewee today is Jim Downey, and I'm Chuck Lundquist. Jim, it's good to have you here. Could we start out by letting you tell us a little bit about where you spent your youth, where you got educated, and how you got into the space business?
Okay, we'll do it. Actually, I spent my youth in Birmingham, Alabama. Went to elementary school and high school in Birmingham. And then I went to the University of Alabama, close by where my mother's family came from, an old home place down there. Spent years down there getting a BS in mechanical engineering. One part of that was, this was during the Korean War, and I was in advanced ROTC. And upon graduation, I was given a reserve commission in the Air Force. They then gave me an opportunity to go to 2 more years of graduate study, as a commissioned officer. And it was to be in physics and math, and ending up with a master's degree in nuclear engineering. I went to North Carolina State College, now North Carolina State University. There were some 80 Air Force officers at that time, all studying nuclear engineering. The reason for that emphasis was that the Air Force had big plans for a nuclear-powered aircraft, which was not to be. Originally, it was going to be kind of a flying test bed, but then they laid more and more requirements on it to where it had to outperform any existing chemical bomber, totally infeasible to do it, and so the whole program went away. The fact that this was going to happen was obvious by the time I got out of my coursework at NC State in 1954. So, at any rate, I didn't expect to work on the nuclear-powered aircraft program. It fizzled along a few years, but then it went totally away. I was assigned then to Wright Air Development Center to complete my 5-year commitment with the Air Force, and I worked in various contracting activities, learned a lot about government contracting and that kind of thing. It was interesting work, but not what I wanted to do the rest of my life. I just got married, so my idea then was to get the best job, i.e. the best paying job I could find. And it wasn't going to be in nuclear engineering because they were a dime a dozen all over the place, glutted market. I signed on with a refinery down in Amoco Refinery in Destrehan, Louisiana. It was not too long after I got there, it became obvious the refinery the oil business was going through one of its slumps. It was obvious the refinery was in deep trouble, and our refinery was the oldest, dating back to the turn of the century, literally. Our plain air compressors were 1897 or something like that. Really? Yeah. Had pistons on them the size of garbage cans. And at any rate, the equipment was terribly obsolete. It was going to have to be renovated and redone. And so the company, make a long story short, they closed that refinery down. I'd seen the writing on the walls. It was not a small refinery. There were some 80 engineers on staff, chemical and mechanicals, and then a total of almost 1,000 people at the refinery. And they closed those gates and fired everybody to the last man, except maybe one chief engineer or something. At any rate, as that was occurring, I contacted an old friend of mine from Alabama Mechanical Engineering days, Jack Waite, who was working up here then, known well to everybody who went through the Marshall system.
We interviewed him a few days ago.
Oh, you did?
We did.
Oh, good. Well, at any rate, Jack made arrangements for me to get interviewed, although at the moment I was ready to come, they weren't doing, they went through hiring spurts on and off during that period. But at any rate, I came up and was interviewed, and through just great fortune, I got on with George Booker in his office under Ernst Stuhlinger. Wonderful people, and of course Ernst is very much of a father figure to me. Just a remarkable man who's had a wonderfully long and productive life. At any rate, that's how I started in that research, survey, and requirements office.
What year was that then?
It was, excuse me, I missed that. I came on in late '58 and went into that organization. Now, one of our principal activities was to assimilate research and technology requirements from all the labs throughout the center. And we got to meet a lot of people. It was, you know, had to edit, reconstitute those tasks, package them in some kind of neat way, take them up to headquarters and try to get funding for the program.
I think that was called a supporting research program, wasn't it?
It was called a supporting research program, and basically everything needed to kind of gradually tied back to Apollo and Saturn in some, at least a remote way. Yeah, but that's what we were very much involved in that activity. Now, also, I should mention that George Bucher, and later he went off to finish his doctorate work, and he was succeeded by Gentry Miles. Both Gentry and George were very gracious to let me go work on some areas in the lab that were not their direct responsibility, losing a little bit of my physics background. And I should perhaps mention that at that time, as I recall, we had your physics and astrophysics branch, the thermophysics branch under Gerhard Heller, and the nuclear and ion physics branch under Russ Shelton. And so with my nuclear background, I kind of focused in doing some things with Russ Shelton, and at any rate, I had some interesting work to do.
Just making a point about that supporting research program. It was a little bit unique. The idea was that each of the engineers that were responsible for designing one part or another of the rockets were allowed to suggest what research needed to be done to advance their particular discipline,
right.
And then you and your associates came along and helped implement that.
Right. And
that was a very unique program.
Yes, it was, and we kind of, I think, pioneered the way for the task description, task area system later used by OAST. At any rate, so let me, just kind of following on down some thoughts.
Well, I guess the space, or the research project lab at the time Marshall was created was transformed over to Marshall with a different name.
Yeah, and we didn't. I didn't even notice that transition because I just went to the same office doing the same thing with the same people, and the next day.
Different signature on the paycheck, but that was about it.
Yeah, right. Any rate, I covered the principal organizations in the lab, and of course at some later date both you and Gerhard Heller became directors of that laboratory. Also, I should mention in that era, the center was involved in the NERVA nuclear rocket program, nuclear heat exchanger rocket, and Space Sciences Lab, then Research Projects, I'll use those interchangeably. Research Projects division was involved in doing radiation effects and nuclear shielding studies. And in Russ Shelton's group, he had a number of people. He had come from AEC background at Oak Ridge and Savannah River and so forth. So they'd been doing radiation transport calculations. There were some very bright people, and I was very pleased to get a little exposure to working with them. Let me talk about lunar studies, because
please do.
That
came onto the horizon pretty fast.
Yes, it did, and actually, I found out in years past there had been a number of studies done by ABMA, a multi-volume classified document that was still classified a few years ago for reasons that obscure to me, but at any rate, it was a rather comprehensive study of lunar program, and actually some concepts of lunar roving vehicles were, discussed at that time. Now, when I got involved, we were, I was going to make the point that in mid-1950s, these lunar studies were under ABMA, and when I first we really got busy on lunar things in SSL in the early 60s, and you may remember there was a 10-volume report, a huge in-house document, many volumes, covered all aspects of a lunar mission, and no contractors, to my knowledge, were involved. And our sections in SSL were Volume 9 on mobility concepts, lunar roving vehicle, and Volume 10 on payloads. And I had the responsibility for Volume 10, along with the many people in SSL that I worked with. I've just mentioned extemporaneously some people that made real contributions. I would like to mention Al Weber, who was a part-time professor with us, and he was remarkably helpful in that work in constituting the lunar payloads. The Volume 9 on mobility, lunar roving mobility vehicles and mobility, was the principal workers on that one, the George von Tiesenhausen's group, which then was in a quite different organization under DBUS, Launch Operations. I guess it was the director of the division or something, but he's separate from a separate entity. At any rate, there were some very bright guys working for von Tiesenhausen, including Gene Oliver, Dave Cramlett, and Ted Carey, and I'm sure there were others I don't remember. They did some wonderful work, and I remember in that era didn't have desktop calculators. They were working with working longhand calculations of these long drawn-out empirical equations for mobility on granular materials, and at any rate, they did a lot of work grinding it out and how easy it would have been to do it in the current era. But at any rate, they did some very good work on the mobility area. And in the payloads area, we looked into a number of payloads for the lunar surface, including optical astronomy payloads, radio astronomy payloads, lunar drill concepts, which John Bensko managed for us, surface and subsurface probes, and I'm sure there were others that don't come to mind at the moment, but we were looking at kind of a comprehensive array of payloads that would support the lunar science program. And at any rate, that was some very interesting work. I really got my teeth into it, and was rolling along pretty good. But then Dr. Stuhlinger, in his electric propulsion area, he had a whole array of small contracts scattered throughout the lab, and he wanted to kind of get them together in a place where I could see what was going on, and he needed basically to set up a program control office. So he asked me to take on that responsibility. I think nobody else wanted it, perhaps. I don't know, but I was happy to get it. That was my first quote, supervisory job. I didn't know who I was supervising other than myself and a small fraction of a secretary. But at any rate, I jumped into the electrical propulsion office, and that was in August of '61. Now, no sooner than I hardly got my arms around that program as reflected in that report I just had, unpublished report I just had, a little memo I had out on the table. And that was in August. I went into that office. In November, there was a thing came down that said the whole electric propulsion program of Marshall's was being transferred to the Lewis Research Center. I hadn't even hardly gotten to, unpacked before that was issued. And so then my motivation was to get those contracts transferred to Lewis as soon as possible.
How many were there roughly?
25 small contracts over a number of years. There were some major contracts with Hughes, EOS, Plasmadyne, Avco, but a whole smattering of bits and pieces here and there. And I was just real shocked when they moved the program up to Lewis. Now, Lewis had done some good work in electric propulsion. Harold Kaufman had developed the Kaufman engine up there and an iron engine. And at any rate, so with that decision to transfer that program, I wanted to get out of it as soon as possible. So
obvious move.
Right. So I tried to get through it the best I could, but I went back and started working lunar programs again. So Stuhlinger let me stay in an office he called then, renamed it Special Projects Office, and that job was to go out and get new business if we could. And but we were concentrating on the lunar surface science. Let's see, it was about, you had gone up to SAO at the time, but at any rate, and I think you had.
Well, I was at SAO, but I was involved in a counterpart. I was a member of the NASA Group for Lunar Exploration Planning that put together what actually went to the moon on each on each mission.
Oh,
so
yeah, that was interesting.
We used a lot of the ideas that you generated.
Yeah, well, that was some good work and really enjoyed it. In mid-1963, I hired Herman Garreau from the Air Force. He was toying with the idea of going to work in NASA headquarters. The Air Force was mothballing its lunar program. People didn't know it at the time, but they had a rather large program of lunar activity. I think it was based on the concept of high ground, but it really didn't, hold any serious strategic advantage that anybody could really see. At any rate, we hired Herman, and he came to join us in 1963, and he was a very much of an instrumental part in my career through the many years. But later in 1963, just out of the blue, we received a visit from Donald A. Beatty, who was in NASA headquarters, and I forget his exact organizational situation up there, but he came down to visit us, and I was met him with some skepticism. This guy says he's got money, he's ready for us to, give it to us if we can convince him we know what we're doing, and he'll support some contracts. And so we gave him pretty good briefings. We had people all, standing up, been doing a lot of work for several years in-house, but no contracts, and he was well impressed. And at any rate, he funded a number of studies for us, including the lunar drills, things I mentioned earlier, surface and subsurface probes, and in-place scientific station. And
were you involved in the planning of the seismic array?
Yes, that seismic array was. The sensors were part of that ESS package, very important array, incidentally, right? And
just as an aside, let me mention that there was one large meteor impact on the moon during the period that the array was operating later. And at the moment, the resolution of the lunar imagery is getting to the point where we hope we can identify that crater that was detected by your seismic array.
Right. That's interesting indeed.
So things keep coming
back. Well, one other thing Don Beatty helped us with, he introduced me to the people. He was a geologist done oil exploration work in South America, and he introduced us to the group out at Flagstaff. Specifically Eugene Shoemaker and Jack Smith, who I knew very well before he became...
Probably Hal Mazursky.
Hal Mazursky, yes indeed, did a lot of the mapping work, and many others. They had an extraordinarily capable group. And that was a very pleasurable time when we did the field studies out there and visited USGS, very interesting region, got interested in geology and so forth. I should mention that after Don, later, after the Apollo program, he retired from NASA and went to work for DOE and became head of the DOE's solar and wind energy programs. And then, after a distinguished career from the DOE, he retired from the government. And one of the things he undertook after that and did accomplish was he did a book under the funding of Smithsonian called For a Few Pounds of Science. It was talking about getting a few pounds of science to the lunar surface in the Apollo program. And I was very pleased that in that book he spoke very favorably of our group at Marshall. He even remembered that first encounter he had with me when I'm kind of, who is this guy? Greeting him with skepticism. But he was a good friend to us through the years and did some very good work.
Were the laser reflectors part of the program too?
Yes, yeah. And
that's another long playing part of the lunar program. Right, they're still being used and observed.
It's still amazing the distance accuracy that one can derive from those reflectors. And at any rate, I want to say a little bit more about the in-place scientific station, ESS. We call it ESS.
I got ahead of the game a little bit.
Oh, well, you mentioned that's fine. It fits in. The ESS. We were working real hard on it, and we had a major contractor under Bendix Systems Division in Ann Arbor. Dr. Lyle Tiffany was quite an individual up there, a really brilliant chap who was good, and many others, Gene Zaitsev and many others I can mention. At any rate, as we were working that area, a decision was made about, at any rate, they're going to transfer the lunar science program. All of it went to Houston. That was about 2 years later, and I don't remember the exact date, Chuck. It escapes me, but I frankly was devastated.
That was under Will Hess at Houston.
Yeah, right. And at any rate, they did that transfer, and Houston used we were getting ready to go out on a development contract for the ESS, and Houston used our technical statement of work, and it became that Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Package, ALSEP. So, at any rate, that went to Houston, and as I say, after all the work we had done on the lunar surface stuff, I was just devastated. The lunar roving vehicle work did remain at Marshall as a vehicle system. At any rate, we were looking for work, looking for things to do, and I'll give myself credit for having a real good insight, and Stuhlinger has given me credit for this too, of suggesting the high energy astronomy program. Von Braun had asked Stuhlinger to look into what we might do in the way of astronomy. In that era, Goddard was having a terrible time with the Orbital Astronomical Observatory program, which they finally got straightened out, and it was a very ambitious program for its place and time. But at any rate, Stuhlinger, I talked to a number of people, and people like Herb Friedman at NRL, Jack Gibbons' people at Oak Ridge had visualized some massive experiments that would need heavy experiments, big area experiments, needing a lot of shielding to do high energy radiation studies in space. But kind of the mental outlook at that time was you don't do experiments of this, scientific experiments of this size. You know, science experiments are supposed to be much smaller. At any rate, we talked to Von Braun about this, and I presented just Ernst and I and Von Braun around his table, and I talked a while and didn't have any concepts really, just some thoughts and scattered, opinions and what might be done. And he said, it's kind of big stuff, and Marshall was pretty good at doing big things. So Dr. Von Braun bought it. He said, let's go do it. He said, let's put some meat on these bones before you go forward with it, so you have some ideas and concepts. And so we started beating the bushes around and talked to other potential investigators, got other candidate experiments, and finally got it presented to headquarters over some trials and tribulations that we had taken some initiatives that normally should have gone through the headquarters, but they got over that. It's often better to seek forgiveness and approval at times, and so we
and that's a well-known technique in this game.
Right. We were at any rate forgiven, and that program evolved. Originally, we had the original concept, and we called it EMR, electromagnetic radiation. Originally, we had a two-launch vehicle program, 2 large payloads on Atlas Titan Centaur, and then the program ran into some money problems. It went into a hiatus for about a year. It was suspended. I should mention that Marshall did establish a program office under Rod Stewart and Hans Fichtner to run the program, but at any rate, it was suspended, and after it came out of this hiatus, it emerged as a better program, a 3-mission program be launched on Atlas Centaur with a pointing mission, the Riccardo Giacconi's high-energy telescope that was X-ray telescope, which was flown on HEO2.
Ricardo's activity in that era and in that area led him to get the Nobel Prize many years later.
Yeah. All of us, in a very remote way, I felt a very, very small, infinitesimal piece of that, and was very pleased that he received that award. And at any rate, those were good days. So we had sent the Lunar Surface Science program to Houston and was back to look for more work. But in about the same stroke of decision, Marshall was assigned responsibility for the development of Skylab, which was a good trade indeed, a very important program. And of course, we also on Skylab had responsibility for Apollo telescope mount and those experiments that constituted the ATM, solar physics experiments. So we ended up with some good work in that trade-off, and we began to work in the area of, we were concerned about optical contamination on manned spaceflight mission with good reason. And I remember stealing a name, Jim Dozier's Mr. Contamination, which I thought was, at any rate, he was kind of heading
a great job to have.
Right. At any rate, he was, we were very much involved in that, and my group made a couple of experiments to fly on Skylab to measure contamination, both array-type contaminants and then backscattered light from particles. Just looking at the time.
We're doing fine.
Okay.
Keep going.
I will tell a little side story because I think it's worth it. While we were doing this, we were coupled up pretty closely with Martin, Martin Company, who was very much involved in Skylab and with major contracts. And they had a young scientist out there who was interested in doing some of the backscattering experiment, but I can't remember the gentleman's name. At any rate, he was supposed to submit an experiment to the Manned Spaceflight Experiments Board, and he got tangled up in some kind of local politics, and his managers wouldn't let him, local company politics, wouldn't let him go forth with it, and nobody else knew enough about it. So at any rate, we wanted to go ahead and get that thing going. So I had a co-op working for me, a very mature-looking co-op named Bob Morris, going to Purdue University. His father was the man for whom the Morris Auditorium is named, Delmars Morris. At any rate, we were rushing to get all the pieces of paper needed to get it ready for the review by the MSFEB, and we sent Bob Morris up there to present that.
As a co-op student.
I mean, usually you have, associate directors for engineering and other notables, chiefs, right. So Bob's up there, and he's a very poised, well-spoken young fellow. And he presents that experiment, and it gets accepted. And then I'm getting a call from, a couple of people. Who is that young man? What is he? He says, the co-op student. They were absolutely incredulous. They had no more belief in that than mine. So at any rate, that started the experiment, which had the number of TO-27. And of course, Bob went back to his studies at Purdue University. But he did not become an engineer or an astronaut, as he aspired to. He became a pretty widely known eye surgeon, retinal surgeon. He has a large group down in Birmingham, and I actually had a detached retina, which was one of his associates up here fixed for me. So Bob had a very illustrious career.
You helped get him started.
Yeah. Or, maybe he helped me get me started. I don't know, but he was a good man, just good man.
Well, that's a good little anecdote. Yeah. I'm glad you put it in.
Right. At any rate, we continued to work along on some Skylab-related things. We just didn't drop it cold turkey. We worked along, and particularly on ATM things in SSL, although the real engineering work was under Bill Horton. Bill Horton and Rain Easy were the kind of the principals in the program office and in astronautics on ATM. So things were, I'm kind of jumping from one epoch to another in my career, and of course it's very self-focused because that's what I'm
Sure.
But at any rate, it came a time when people in the lab were suggesting to Gerhard Heller that he should, become full-time deputy and give the thermophysics division to somebody else. Gerhard decided not to do this. He wanted to give the full-time deputy to somebody else, and he didn't want to leave thermophysics, and that was his choice. So Dr. Stuhlinger asked me in 1968, April of 68, to become his acting deputy. And I was very humble and flattered that he would ask me, but I knew really what he needed was not a scientist to try to, go up front. He needed somebody to help him work administrative problems, work some people problems, run some, try to push things along, and he thought I maybe could do that pretty well. And so I was very pleased to get up to the front office and help him. Herman Garreau continued with the payload projects division, and George Bucher was still a key figure in the lab during that time. So at any rate, I stayed there for several months till the end of '68. As I recall, they asked Ernst von Braun asked him to become associate director for science for the center, and he of course accepted that and went up to the front office. And then there I was as an acting deputy director and acting laboratory director, reporting to Herman Widener, whom I hardly knew, and I felt very, very lost when Ernst went up. Recall, I thought maybe it'd be advisable for me to introduce myself to Herman Widener and set a meeting with him, so I did. And his instructions, we kind of, as I recall, went along these lines. Okay, just don't do anything you can't finish down there. Don't stir up anything new. Just hold it together, please. So I guess I'd stirred up a nest of problems with Hill, but at any rate, so I hung on down there. But I didn't have to hang on too long because Dr. von Braun made a decision to form the Program Development Directorate, and this. And he even personally asked me to head up the Mission and Payload Planning Office only after Lucas, of course, had given me but there wasn't any way I was going to think about turning that down. That was a real opportunity. And of course, Dr. Lucas.
That's when Lucas became director of the Program Development.
Right. Dr. Lucas came over as director of Program Development Office. And let me just say a little bit about that organization. My Mission and Payload Planning Office was kind of the scientific wing of program development. There was a advanced systems office under Bill Huber that did basically vehicle studies, and then there was a program planning and control office under Bill Sneed, worked project plans and cost estimates and that kind of thing. But the real strength in program development was in the engineering organization under Eric Gerner, and it had several branches. And that organization of maybe 90 or 100 people represented every engineering discipline in the center, and people that had a lot of experience coming out of various programs and projects. And any kind of proposal we wanted to put together, we had a self-contained organization that could do a conceptual design, the preliminary design, and we could really hold our own in a direct technical competition with any other center anytime we got involved in such. So that was an interesting era, and program development, I think, generated many, many programs for the center during that decade or so.
Meanwhile, Gerhard Heller became director of space science.
Right. They finally filled that. I'm glad you mentioned that. They plugged that vacuum, and he was that was a good step. I don't know why they waited so long. I guess he wanted to stay with thermophysics group, maybe. I don't know.
He was devoted to his science, very devoted to it.
Right. At any rate, we in PD we had a number of studies. Gosh, just a whole gamut of things were going on. Everything from manned planetary science studies, the report I flashed out early on to Hugh Dudley and others. But let me focus on the most important studies that were in my group, and these regarding experiment modules. We had both free-flying experiment modules and attached modules. But before I go further, I have overlooked the most important, perhaps, function in PD those days was the shuttle task team was still located in PD as an emerging project. So that was, crucial to the center's future and everything else. Also, there was a space station task team, but it proved not to go anywhere in that era. It fizzled. Back to my group with the experiment modules, attached and free-flying modules. The free-flying modules were tended by the, like astronomy things. You wanted to were tended by the shuttle, and then went off and did their observations for months on end until another shuttle came along. Serviced them, replenished them, and that evolved, as you can see, into the concept that was used for the Hubble Space Telescope, shuttle visited and so forth. The other kind of modules we looked at remained attached to the shuttle and went up with the shuttle and came back with the shuttle. And as you see, that was the Space Lab concept coming out of that. It was patterned. The first time I ever really heard that discussed in my group, it was an idea by Max 9, just as a chat over the table, what he was doing. And he was comparing it to the Convair 990 program at Ames, a research aircraft program, where a bunch of scientists could get on the aircraft, had various viewports and facilities for their equipment and data recorders. They flew up into regions of the atmosphere that weren't, to do certain observations not available from the Earth's surface, and then they came right back down. And so that was where the Space Lab concept was patterned after that. Doug Lloyd wrote a very nice book on Space Lab, but I don't believe he gave Max 9 credit for any of the original ideas. Of course, and there was a guy in headquarters, Bill Armstrong. I don't know whether he had basically the same idea at the same time, and he was pushing it right along. So, at any rate, those were two big success stories that came out of that work on experiment modules.
The program office was supposed to capture new business for Marshall, and it did.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Well, that's the way it should work. When HEO became a going program, it wasn't transferred to another center. I felt real good about that because I had some pitfalls along the way in that regard. And at any rate, I felt real good about the way HEO evolved, and as I say, the program was better defined after the hiatus than it was when I turned it over to the new group. And at any rate, it was a lot of rewarding work in that era. I should mention, let me say a thing about a couple other people. I don't know whether you'll interview them down the line or not, but Harry Kraft. Harry.
I intend to get Harry in here if I can.
Yeah, he started off working in the applications group under Ted Carey, and he was very much involved in the attached modules stuff area. And then he later went on when O.C. Gene, I'll get to that. At any rate, a new organization formed. Harry Kraft went on with O.C. Gene, remained with Space Lab, and continued. He was the mission manager on Space Lab 1, which flew in '83. And later, after I retired in '89, he took over that office, and so Harry remained from the very inception of Space Lab. He was with it all the way to the end. Same thing I can say for Gene Oliver and his work in the astronomy group relative to free-flying modules. He went through my office, and then he on in as the Large Space Telescope, now Hubble, as that evolved. He went right along with it as chief engineer, and so he worked that program all the way through to his retirement. In fact, he went on and worked Chandra. I want to call it ACCEF from the old days.
Yeah.
He worked that program, and at any rate, we had some very good times. I should mention Bob Odell's role. He came to the center, and we really needed somebody of his stature to represent the program.
He was an astronomer, of course.
Right. Bob was an astronomer, and he came from Rice University, as I recall, and he, at any rate, he was invaluable to us. And one thing that I directly credit Odell for is the earlier concepts of the space telescope we had, kind of phase A, pre-phase A concepts. We had the instruments, the whole telescope was built around a set of instruments. And so Bob said, we got to make this thing where these instruments can be slid in and out of the focal plane, modular, so to speak, with clean interfaces. And so he turned that whole thing around, and that really made the whole Hubble concept viable, you know. And of course, Bob made many, many other contributions. One of the traumatic phases during my running of my involvement with Space Telescope was when we decided to change from a 3-meter primary mirror to a 2.4-meter primary mirror. And that decision probably made Hubble a viable program instead of an invalid and, program withered destined to go away, because the payload carrying capability of the shuttle was going down, as one would expect. And, of course, the weight of any newly developed program goes up as it evolves. And so you're going to see that here telescope gets heavier and heavier, and the shuttle can carry less and less. You could see what was happening. And so we just said, let's cut it right now. And there were other good reasons to do this, facilities considerations, handling of large optics, and so forth. So we made that change. It was some of the people in the science community, it was like we betrayed them, but then they all got behind it and said, yeah, this is probably for the better. And so the change was made. Change was made. I went on Harry. It'd be good to interview Harry Craft and Gene Oliver, I think.
We shall.
From the earlier days. From 1972 to 1976, we had formed an LST task team, and I was named task team manager. And so at that time on, I was immersed in trying to get that program sold to the Congress.
LST being Large Space Telescope.
Excuse me, I keep reverting to the earlier terminology, Large Space Telescope. Yeah, to get that program approved by Congress, and that was no small doing. We made I don't know how many trips to Washington, back and forth with various plans and information, and we were faced up with a lot of opposition in Congress, the usual comments from Proxmire, this great government waste of money, and so forth and so on. But finally,
did you get a Golden Fleece Award?
No, I regret. I did not get a Golden Fleece Award.
All right.
But I think it got to where every ground-based astronomer in the country of any note was really saying this is something you need to do. First, some of them were skeptical, holding back, but the whole astronomy community.
The astronomy community got behind space telescopes.
Yeah, and in a big way. Some very people like Lyman Spitzer and John McCall went tirelessly working with us, lobbying Congress, frankly, pushing the thing along. And so it finally we got the approval for LST, got it through Congress. Let's see, I get the dates, sometimes I get real confused as to what area we were in, but after I finished the work on Space Telescope, I became Jim Murphy's deputy director to PD.
That was the period when Jim Murphy had replaced...
Dr. Lucas had skipped that. Yes, indeed.
Dr. Lucas had been promoted to center director, and Jim Murphy took over
as deputy. As director
of
PD
program development.
And then O.C. Jean took over as the deputy director.
Yes.
And O.C. Jean then was established to handle the Space Lab payloads activities. Jack Lee was handling Space Lab, so that marriage between payloads and Space Lab payloads, between Space Lab development and payloads, I think worked very, very well through the years, and it was a good decision. Now, at any rate, I continued to work in PD as the deputy, and I was concentrating on AXAF. And we were in a head-to-head competition, and that's Sean Turner. We were in a head-to-head competition with Goddard and with JPL. Competitive proposals submitted and so forth, and so, make a long story short, we were selected to manage AXAF. The selection letter from headquarters indicated that our proposal for having a joint management relationship with Smithsonian was a big factor in our being selected, and so that worked, I thought, well through the years. The strength of the MSFC SAO team was good, and so, at any rate, let's say in about 1991, yes, it was 1991. I was as deputy director of PD at the time. O.C. Jean and a group of people in Space Lab payloads retired, including O.C., Carlos Haygood, Bob Pace, Pete Hall, and I'm thinking, my goodness, Dr. Lewis says, can you go down there and run that place, please? So I, of course, did, but I had some trepidation. What's going to happen to all these key people leaving? Nothing happened at all. They were OC had picked some good people. They were well trained. I didn't have to do anything other than not rock the boat. You know, it was off and running. We didn't fly the first Space Lab mission until 1983, the first Space Lab module mission. And Space Labs 3 and 2 came in that order in 1985. And all those missions were very highly successful. And I really had some good people working in that organization. The mission managers for the first 3 missions that we flew, Harry Kraft, Roy Lester, and Joe Cremin, all had totally different approaches to manage, different personalities. You expect all of them were successful. It's just various ways you can energize a team and get a job done. Mm-hmm. They were all very successful. Rain Easy group managed over 100 flight experiments under my Space Lab payloads activities, and the great majority of those were successful. Rain, really a very experienced chap coming out of ATM, very cool, solid, you know, person who really knew his, had good information and good instincts. And so he managed the experiments group there, and all of that went well. I just mentioned as a side, I saw on several occasions having guys in orbit could do some hands-on things to fix things that weren't exposed to be fixed, but, you know, interceded in some very effective ways. And so, at any rate, I think all in all, the Space Lab program was you know, really successful activity, and I was real pleased to be a part of it. Of course,
I might just put in a comment here. Bob Nauman was contracted here at UAH by Marshall some years ago to do a review of the science results of Space Lab, and it was a very favorable review.
Right, I recall that document. I should mention it. Of course, Bob Nauman's a wonderful fellow that I worked with through the years, just another one of the great scientists that came out of SSL and through Marshall. Yes, I remember that well. And in fact, we were trying to do a little NASA history from the Retirees Association, and Bob came to our systems where I think the thing was really getting messed up, and Bob did some editing and cleaned it up. So he's helped a great deal through the years, and I certainly admire him. And also Bill Snoddy was a guy that came out of SSL who took my job in PD as a deputy and finished out his career up there in PD. Charlie Darwin became the director. So, of course, I thought the good times at Marshall, despite the ups and downs, it was a good place to work till the terrible tragedy of Challenger. And, of course, with Space Lab missions, that just brought things to an abrupt halt. We knew we were going into a long hiatus. Fortunately, we were doing some work for General Abramson's Star Wars program. He had an interest in some of his people in flying optical payloads for various purposes on a Space Lab mission. And so we were very much involved in working with him, and was our contractor, and I should give full credit in Space Lab payloads to our Teledyne Brown engineering group, who when they were working the Abramson payload, and General Abramson, fortunately, his office was much more lavishly funded than anything I had been accustomed to, so they just weren't having to pinch every penny, you know. And so we were able to continue our activities, and I'm grateful to have that work in support of General Abramson's office and the Star Wars program, because it kept our contractor busy and kept him employed. So, any rate, after Challenger, it wasn't quite the place it was before Challenger, in my view, Chuck. It was just, of course, a different world, and although I was able to, I finally retired in '89. Space Lab missions went on after that I started under my purview but had to be delayed, including Astro, which we inherited from Goddard, International Microgravity Lab, Space Lab J, the Japanese Space Lab mission, worked that for several years. All those missions came in the early 90s after I retired. And you know, there was never any problem about getting people to sign up to fly on Space Lab missions. It was a very clamored for opportunity. You didn't have to sell anything. You had to decide who you wanted to fly. It was, I think the only criticism we got from Space Lab, from NASA headquarters, was they were afraid it would undercut space station because it was a very versatile tool.
Yes.
Very versatile tool. In fact, you had to stretch around to find experiments that couldn't be done in a 2 or 3 weeks mission at the onset. You know, there were certain ones that could, and I'm talking about astronomy experiments and so forth, when that was not the place to be done on the shuttle. You know, they needed to do them as free flyers.
The thing that really would have, or that did worry the Houston people, was the power module, where one would have brought the shuttle up to this power module that remained in orbit and had power to remain in orbit longer to do more experiments.
I like that concept. Well, that really scared them to death.
Oh, it did.
And then they offered something they called PEP.
Yeah.
PEP was a power extension package. It was a solar array that they you know, it's just pitiful response to this power module. But they was really.
It's a shame the power module was never done.
Right. Right, it was a shame. And there was another program I wasn't intending to mention, but I was interested in, was a science and applications, we call it science and applications space station. It was a much smaller space station than the International Space Station, much, much smaller. And it would have been periodically tended by the shuttle and been integrated basically on the ground. And so I'm just amazed they were able to do it. The sophistication of the International Space Station to bring all those pieces together and get them all up there. And very formidable program. The Science and Applications program, Bill Snoddy worked in the headquarters. Jim Balance went up there to work it with. Andy Stofan was a big champion of it, but the powers that be wanted to be on the grander stage, you know, and I'm sure those decisions were well founded because they wanted to, you know, international space and all the bells and accoutrements on it.
Coming back to the power module, there's a little anecdote I might add. There was a request for proposals of things to do during the early flights of the shuttle, and the lab directors at Marshall formed an investigation team, put in a proposal to do a small demonstration power module. And when NASA headquarters got a proposal where all the investigators were the Marshall laboratory director, they were just totally amazed in what to do with it.
I didn't remember that. That's a good. No, I didn't remember that. That was indeed a good.
It would have made use of the solar arrays that were left over from Skylab, and I think we proposed to do it for very little money. It was a camel's nose in the tent kind of a proposition.
Well, when OC left, I talked about how good and capable those people were, and I just want to mention a couple of names here as I wind things up. Jack Bean was a wonderful cost guy, programmatic guy. Only guy I could see would just work with reams and reams of data and paper and assimilate it all and not make a mistake. I mean, he was meticulous and thorough. And Jerry Allen, the Central Comptroller, told me, Jack, don't have to worry about him. He's the best I ever worked with in his area. And so I had Jack Bean. I credited Bob Pace, who had set up a very good system. And hey, this is worth mentioning. I don't want to overlook it. Bob, in the Skylab era, the government accepted those experiments and then took over ownership of the experiments from the investigators. So the government ended up knowing as much about the experiment and crawling through it and redoing everything as the investigators did. And it was a pretty inefficient situation. So Bob Pace had said the idea, hey, let's keep the onus for the investigators, on the experiments, responsibility on the backs of the investigators. A brilliant decision, because there's no one more concerned with the success or failure of the experiment than the principal investigators. I haven't yet seen one that wasn't a good manager. You know, I used to say, oh, scientists can't manage. You know, they interested in manage. They can do it. And they were, of all Rainey's experiments, virtually every one of them that were done by the PIs was successful. Only you're aware of some of the problems we had trying to refly some of the old spar hardware. which Dr. Lucas referred to as junk, and he was right. I mean, it was junk for science rocket. When you took a 10-minute experiment, tried to keep it going for a week in orbit without much, it wasn't, the design was not there. You didn't have the heat sink of the rocket to rely on. So we had some problems with those experiments. And I remember Dick Halpern telling me, he was then responsible for some of those payloads in headquarters. Dick said, well, hey, we got all this stuff. It's going to go to waste if we don't do something with it. He said, nothing ventured, nothing gained. But, the way NASA is, a big downside to failure, And so we got some stuff out of those experiments. They weren't all failures, but we had some problems with them, too. But aside from those, all the rest of the experiments just came out great. Right.
Well, what have you done since your retirement? Anything exciting?
Well, maybe not exciting. No, nothing like the joy and excitement of working at Marshall. But I went to, after I retired, as I was retiring, George Hardy contacted me, and he also contacted Bill Sneed. George had a consulting business. He had been in with Bob Lindstrom. Bob Lindstrom was going on to something else, if I recall, at any rate. So George asked us to join him in that endeavor, and so we did. And we originally were just offering ourselves as consultants, and we had a lot of stuff to do and a lot of things. It was interesting and fun. We were kind of still in a continuum of what we had known and worked on at Marshall, and so we had a lot of work to do. And then we started getting some requirements from the people that do some work that we couldn't do, beyond our expertise, background, whatever. So we said, well, we know so-and-so could do that. We know. Next thing you know, we had a team of about 16 people working for us under contract to do space station work from Boeing. And so, at any rate, that was going good for a while. But then we ran into a political situation. They said, let's take all this work and turn it over to a minority contractor. So all our people, which it didn't work out too good. But at any rate, they laid us off overnight. And the good thing we weren't depending on that work for a living, But those kind of things happen. I understand why Boeing had to do it, or did elect to do it. So, at any rate, I was often through the years critical of the space station program, but ended up making money off of it, which is kind of a shame. It had so many things that were, to me, just out of line and just hurry up. Excuse me.
No, you've had a remarkable career, and you've described it very well, and I'm sure the historians of the future will be very pleased to have heard your in-person description of your career.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure. It indeed was a wonderful career, and I was associated with wonderful people throughout the whole thing, with just rare exceptions. All my interfaces were pleasant. Certainly my leadership was outstanding, and it was a great, great place to work. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.